What is happiness? What are some of the ways in which we make ourselves unhappy? And how do we attain happiness? Today on Spirit Spire, we talk about happiness, love, and the transforming power of God's mercy, starting right now. Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Spire. And now, here is your host. Hello everyone, welcome to Spirit Spire. I'm Isaac Fox and I will be your host for today's episode, joined with two of my usual co-hosts, Bryan Cain.
Hello everyone.
And John Sohl.
Hey there.
Erik Huff unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but he will be back soon for future episodes. Today's topic is one of the most fundamental and universally common experiences of every human person, namely the desire for happiness. On the one hand, happiness is something which every one of us, consciously or subconsciously, is seeking to attain. But on the other hand, we may also realize through our own experiences or those around us, or even through looking at statistics of depression, anxiety, that happiness is something which often is not attained, and that many people in our world are very deeply unhappy. Today, we would like to take a look at this timely and very important subject. Our plan today is to break this into three sections and discuss three questions. The first will be, what is happiness? The second, why are we not happy? And then lastly, how do we attain happiness? Bryan's going to lead us out on the first section. So Bryan, very simple, easy question for you. What is happiness?
Yep, simple and easy.
Yeah, not too typical.
I was looking in the catechism and I couldn't find...
Which is why you have really thick books to look through.
Yeah, I couldn't find an exact definition in here. We talked about, we were gesturing at things ahead of the episode in terms of beatitude. Obviously, there's something to do with beholding the face of God. We mentioned desire and the fulfillment of desire, probably on some level. I did think I'd read a couple things from the Catechism to get us started. And so from paragraph 30, it says, "Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Although man can forget God or reject him, he never ceases to call every man to seek him so as to find life and happiness." So I think there's a clue there. There's something connected between seeking God and finding life and happiness. But this search for God demands of man every effort of intellect, a sound will, an upright heart, as well as the witness of others who teach him to seek God. And then it goes on to quote St. Augustine. It says, "You are great, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is without measure. And man, so small a part of your creation, wants to praise you. This man, though clothed with mortality and bearing the evidence of sin and the proof that you withstand the proud. Despite everything, man, though but a small part of your creation, wants to praise you. You yourself encourage him to delight in your praise, for you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." And so I think there's something there too, that there's this desire, there's this restlessness until it rests in God.
And you stole one of my quotes I was going to use.
I think that's one of the most common quotes used in Catholicism and Christianity, and I love that you gave the context to
this
that
is
quote.
the fun of also not having too much time to prepare.
Right.
I'm sure there's going to be some overlap today, and we'll get to build on each other. But
Sure.
But yeah, I mean. So certainly there's a divine aspect of happiness, and sometimes there's Christians who will distinguish between joy and happiness. So they might refer to happiness as sort of a more fleeting like emotion, and joy being sort of a deeper level that undergirds even suffering and things like that. That there's this abiding peace and trust and things like that last through even moments of suffering. I don't mind using the word happiness not just to describe the emotional. I think there's also an element of happiness that is in the intellect and in the will, meaning that I think that on earth we can achieve some level of lasting happiness that yes may ebb and flow, and we may at times have more of it and less of it. But I do think that happiness, not just an emotional happiness, is attainable in this life, and then obviously ultimately fulfilled in heaven.
Well, I think of what you're saying, Brian, like when people are looking at, when you meet someone who's in a really bad relationship, not necessarily abusive, but like just drama, it doesn't seem to be going in the right direction. What's some big question that like their friends are going to ask them? Are you happy? Mm-hmm. They're not going to say, are you joyful? Are you really at peace with your deep sense of existential confidence in God's love? No, they're going to say, are you really happy in this relationship, in the state of things? So what you're saying is right. It resonates because it's not just a fleeting emotion that comes and goes like we oftentimes describe it. That's good maybe in teaching the difference between that fleeting emotion and joy. But using the word happiness to describe something connected with joy, that deep peace, within your state of circumstances in life, your relationships, is, I think, fair and important that we should acknowledge for people when it comes to happiness.
I agree, and I think that part of this is expressed in human history in the sense that the great philosophers were talking about happiness before Christianity and before and outside of the Jewish roots of Christianity even. That people like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates were talking about happiness, and they were they connected happiness to virtue. And so one of the focuses I wanted to talk about in my segment is The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. This is one of my favorite books. We did it in a class with Dr. Christopher Bloom, also known as Saint Severinus. Boethius, I think his story in this book are an awesome key to sort of unlocking happiness and that abiding joy and whatnot. And so to set it up, I'd like to tell the story of Boethius, if that's okay. So Boethius was an advisor to the emperor, to the Roman emperor, and he was very high up, probably second or third in all the empire. And so he had the emperor's ear. He was one of his most trusted advisors. And he had everything. He had a beautiful family. He had the career. He had it all. And then some of his colleagues in the Senate set up and betrayed him and told the emperor that he was working behind his back and that he wanted to become the emperor. And the emperor believed them. And so he put Boethius under house arrest. And so he lost his career. He lost his access to his family and friends, and he was just trapped by himself in a house. And that is the condition under which he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, which is actually a play. And he himself is a character in it, and the other main character is Lady Philosophy. And so he's sitting there in his house under house arrest,
trapped in his mind,
and he's miserable. Yep. And Lady Philosophy comes to visit him in the play, and she says, Boethius, you seem miserable. And he's like, yeah, I am miserable, and here's all the things. And then she says, well, then you've forgotten the lessons of philosophy. Let me remind you of them. And my brief summary of the point of this play is that Boethius, through discussing with Lady Philosophy and her kind of walking him back off the cliff, or not off the cliff, back away from the edge of the cliff, the other direction.
Push him over.
Yeah, exactly. Which on some level might...
you got to take a leap of faith.
Yeah, exactly. But what's cool about this book is that even though he's a Christian saint, this book is purely on a natural level. So this is all prior to, or maybe not natural. There is God, but it's pre-Christian. So this is stuff that you can just reason to, which like the Greek philosophers that I talked about. And so what she gets to is like, yes, you don't have your fame anymore. You don't have your money anymore. You don't have your power. But the problem is that those things don't actually bring happiness, because fame can be lost, and money can be lost, and influence can be lost in these things.
Well, think of the famous story of Job. right? Which I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit today. Right?
So there must be something beyond that, and what he ultimately gets to is that God is perfectly happy. He's perfect happiness, and that it's by virtue and goodness that as we grow in virtue, we become more and more like God. We become like goodness himself. And so as we become more and more like goodness himself is also happiness itself. Mm-hmm. And so as we grow in goodness, we grow in happiness. And so what the point that she makes is you can be good even in prison or in a Russian gulag or wherever you are, you can live out virtue, and that's what ultimately is the foundation of happiness. So obviously there's a Christian dimension as well, which we'll get to.
Sure.
But I thought we could at least start in virtue and virtue as a path to happiness, because I know in my life when I am in those times of despair, usually I need to go to confession. Usually there's some connection to sin or to a slacking off. And then we start projecting it into other situations and into other people and things like that. But the place we should always start looking if we find ourselves not happy is there in our own sin and in our own brokenness, and striving for that virtue, which we'll get to. But immediate thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a couple.
Several.
So, yeah, let's see. Which one to start with? Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, as you're pointing out, Brian, is this is very much in the tradition of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. Well, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. This is looking at virtue to be happy for the good life, mm-hmm. right? So it's very much, while he was a Christian, it's very much in that tradition of the Greek philosophers. It really, really fits right in with that. And so one of the things that kind of occurs to me is that I think virtue, which is something we don't talk about much anymore, right? That's not one of those topics that is really popular. People used to talk about developing virtues or growing in virtue, and it's just not something we speak of.
It's a lost word, sadly. Yeah.
I think it is. Or if we do hear it, it sounds, I don't know, old-fashioned, prudish, something. It just doesn't, whereas it's really a very beautiful word.
And it really is just a good habit, right?
Yes.
So a virtue,
it's developing good habits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A vice, bad habit.
Exactly.
A virtue is a good habit.
I think on the surface, I think there's a deeper way that has been explained to me is virtue is not just getting into good habits, because I know many people who, work out every day, eat healthy all the time, they are focused on all these good habits, waking up early, going to bed early, but they have no real faith or interior life or even a disposition to do the good. In fact, there's a lot of sinfulness in their life.
Right.
And so virtue it's been described to me as this deep disposition toward the good, to which you aspire to get into good habits, but also good thought patterns and desires for goodness. So you consistently desire. Yeah, sure.
So you could have the virtue of exercise and not the virtue of charity, and that would be bad.
Correct, right. I guess virtue in the holistic sense. You're right.
Yeah, a virtuous man maybe is kind of more what you're gesturing at.
Right.
That there's a hierarchy of virtues.
Exactly.
And there's the theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity.
That's exactly what I was going to point out is when we look at the ancient Greek philosophers, they were big on virtue. Mm-hmm. And they had a list of virtues which, in Catholic moral teaching, we would still discuss, but they're considered the natural virtues, right. Prudence, temperance, fortitude, all of those. But where Christianity gets different is this addition at the very highest level of the three theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and charity. And the only one that lasts, of course, eventually, when we no longer need hope and faith, is love, charity. And so it was kind of occurs to me that the virtues fit us, make us to be able to receive happiness. And even the ancient pagan philosophers understood this, but they could only go so far.
Right.
And I think that, look at Socrates, for example. There is something profoundly at peace and a certain real nobility about his death, He definitely, all of those three men seem to have probably lived very virtuous lives. And And so that's great. There's some levels of natural happiness there that flow out of those natural virtues. But then I look at the lives of the saints, the great mystical experiences and so forth they had. And I think we realize there is something even greater here.
Right.
So I think that the natural virtues change us, shape us, and fit us to receive some level of happiness, but that the theological virtues, which we call them that because they not only relate to God, they come from God. We can't do these. The natural virtues were things that every human to some level could do. You could work on being more disciplined. You could work on being more patient.
Yes.
But the theological virtues have to be a gift from God, and those are the ones that suit us eventually to receive that complete level of happiness at the end.
And my heart swells with joy when you say that, Isaac, because it's true. Like, we think of the virtue as something you want to, make happen in your life. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard, do it like the American dream, right?
Yeah. And that's
be
good.
a good person. It is good, right? And I remember, having that.
Well, I tried to pull
mentality.
myself up by my bootstraps once. I didn't get off the ground.
Don't feel like that, really.
I remember being a kid and trying to think and wondering why you couldn't do that. I figured if you start with one foot and then quickly pull the other foot and the other, you would somehow get
right,
there.
Right. Well, I was in high school, and I had this mentality of like, work hard, be a good person, and other people around me should figure that out too, including my girlfriend at the time.
Right.
Which, in my heart, I started asking questions about my faith, and I felt this desire to start really taking leaps of faith, going on conferences, retreats, reading books, and getting my questions answered. And she didn't. And it would really irk me. It was very, very difficult. And I would get upset, get frustrated with her, put a lot of pressure on her. And that is part of what led to our breakup, praise God, and pray for her. And I'm happy because here I am with my wife today, right? It's
Why did you gesture at me?
Not you. No, no, but I remember working at Little Caesars, of all places. My boss at the time, he was Catholic, and we would have just random conversations and stuff. And one day, I was explaining my deep frustration to him, and he said, "John, you can't force her or anyone else to have the faith that God has given you. It's a gift.
Yeah.
You can't expect someone to believe and live a certain way if just because you have been given this vision, this ability to see and to trust God at this particular time in your life. You can't do that. That's a gift from God." And it utterly, radically changed my understanding of what virtue is in that sense, because I wasn't happy. I was struggling. I was in pain with a lot of my own sins and frustrations.
And maybe
that opened my eyes.
Maybe you're even needing the virtue of patience with the other person, for example.
I did.
Which I think, to your point, Brian, is the overall virtuous. You can't just take one virtue and be like, I'm going to be this person, and then forget all the rest of them.
Right,
and it's a tree, and it should. I think the way I'm receiving your point, John, is that it all flows out of charity. So God brings us into the good life through baptism, brings us into the Christian life through baptism, and gives us the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. And out of that, we, to him who's given much, much is expected. We're given these talents. We're expected to, invest them and give them back. So it's like, we're given these gifts, and then that's not like God doesn't expect us to just stop, there. Like we are called to develop, to grow, to bear fruit. And so charity should lead us to be attempting at least to practice good habits. And that's where individual charisms and gifts and traits come through. We probably have some of the same virtues, and we probably have some that are different, and we probably have some of the same vices, and we probably have some that are different.
Sure.
And so, we all have charity, and so charity is leading me today to, try to pick up the laundry off my floor after my wife tells me for the 35th time this year or whatever. That out of charity is a virtue that I'm trying to work on, the virtue of tidiness, if you will. But there are some people that are very naturally tidy, and there's not as much virtue. And the more of a habit we get into, the easier it is to sustain it. And so God calls us to practice these virtues over and over again. And marriage is a great lesson or a great teacher the virtues. Who more than our spouses knows our virtues and vices, and can speak to them, and and often we can use our wife's point of view as a barometer or as a compass for where we should.
Well, it's that feminine genius. She can speak into the heart of our own masculinity in a way that maybe other men can't even get through to, and it helps us awaken some of our imperfections and also some of our good traits that we as guys may not even recognize about each other fully, or affirm that within each other because we're all living it. But and it reminds me, like, what attracted me to my wife was her openness, her desire to learn, and all of that. And she helped me live a better life because it forced me to get out of my head of all the things I knew in my faith, and actually explain it in a way that makes more sense and helps me learn it more deeply. And it's a quote from Fulton Sheen I heard. I think he said something along the lines of, if you cannot explain a deep theological truth to a 2-year-old, then in a way that he understands, then you don't understand that deep theological truth as much as you think you do. And I don't know, it just, to me, helped me feel that desire, that ability to live virtue strengthened because of her desire to learn more. It was good.
And ultimately, it has to be lived. It's not enough to just know it.
Yes, it has to be lived, because I wasn't living it as well as I wanted to.
I had a friend, and I'll share this very quickly, and then I know you've got a quote there.
My quote's exactly building on this point.
Yeah.
So it's perfect. Yes.
I had a friend many years ago, and his dad had converted and become a Buddhist, and they had a little, I don't even know what the word would be, kind of like a little altar or whatever in their house, and his dad did the rituals and everything. And I was talking to him once, and his dad did not follow the standard prescriptions of Buddhism. He liked his cigar and his bourbons, and and my friend, I remember telling me once, because apparently his dad had studied Buddhism quite a lot and knew about meditation and all of this and that and I'm not agreeing theologically here, but his comment was, he said, yes, he knows how to attain enlightenment, but doesn't, or something to that effect. or he would tell you he knows the way, but just doesn't make the effort to do that.
Follow it. Right?
And I think that it's so true of us as Christians as well. We get all this great learning about how to be virtuous, what the virtues are, how to live a good life, all of these things, but knowing that is a lot different than actually putting it into practice.
Head
and
and heart.
it will not lead us to happiness until we are living it.
Yeah.
So,
Amen.
To you, Brian.
Yeah, well, and I was just gonna, try to wrap up the segment on what is happiness by reading this quote, which I like, from W. Baron Wolf, an Austrian psychiatrist and author.
Get ready to have your life changed, by the way. One of my favorite quotes of all time.
No pressure on the quote anyway.
Right.
Okay.
If your life has not changed.
Yeah, if it's not, I get it. Here you go.
This guy's an idiot. No. All right, here we go. If you observe a really happy man, you will find him building a boat, writing a symphony, educating his son, growing double dahlias in his garden, or looking for dinosaur eggs in the Gobi Desert. He will not be searching for happiness as if it were a collar button that has rolled under the radiator. He will not be striving for it as a goal in itself. He will have become aware that he is happy in the course of living life 24 crowded hours of the day.
It's beautiful.
And I think that's right.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't know if this guy's religious or not. I don't know much about him, but we would include mass and confession and things like that. But there is a natural level, like I was talking about at the beginning, of the connection between virtue and happiness.
Absolutely.
And we can't grow in virtue sitting on the couch
Right.
with our screen this far in front of our face and our kid pulling on our coat or something.
But not to the other extreme where the crowded hours of the day doesn't mean being constantly busy and focusing on avoiding those deep aspects, because prayer and silence and recreation are good, but it all comes down to your attitude toward it, where you're not thinking your happiness will be contained within this moment.
You're just living. You're just living.
You're just living your life in peace, right?
Yeah. It's a beautiful quote, Brian, and interestingly enough, that ties in directly with where I kind of wanted to start in the next segment. Sure. So maybe this would be a great time to take a very short break and come back after this message with more from Spirit Spire. Hello, everyone. The Marion Center is one of Louisville's true hidden treasures. Located at 165 Sears Avenue in St. Matthews, the Marion Center is a Catholic bookstore and gift shop. It also contains a lending library, a large selection of used books and free materials, and a beautiful Blessed Sacrament chapel. For more information, call the Marion Center at 502-899-5125. God bless. All right, well, welcome back to Spirit Spire. We've been discussing happiness today, and in our first segment, we were talking a bit about what happiness is. And Brian finished us with a really great quote. And one of the kind of what I'm taking away from that quote is this idea. The person, what was his name?
W. Baron Wolf.
W. Baron Wolf. That's kind of a cool name.
That is kind of cool. Yeah.
Is that Austrian psychiatrist?
Yeah.
But he speaks of, if you see a happy man, you don't see him searching for happiness. You see him just living, right? Doing these other things. And so in the second section, I know we want to talk a little bit about reasons for why we aren't happy a lot of the times. And that can be us, or, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that our contemporary world is filled with a lot of really desperate unhappiness, tragically so. Mm-hmm. And I think for anybody watching or listening our show, they know we're Catholics. You know, we're obviously going to say God is the answer.
Sure.
That can also maybe come across as a little bit trite or
not
unhelpful.
Good enough, not substantial. Right?
So I was thinking through this as we prepared for the show and wanted to get a little more some specific details. So there are 4 thoughts that I have that I think relate to why we're often unhappy. And so I'd like to share those with you guys, kind of 4 little nuggets, and then maybe we can crack them open. I also had a quote that went with each one. One of those quotes has already been taken, unfortunately, but we can quote it again.
Yeah, of course. That's a good
one. So the reason that I mentioned the connection is because the very first on my list of 4 things that I think we often do wrong is seeking for happiness, as if it's an end in itself. Mm-hmm. I would say that happiness is a byproduct of something else. And the analogy that came to my mind is that of physical health. Let's suppose I'm not feeling well, and I've got aches and pains, and I'm tired and miserable. Maybe I remember a time earlier in my life, maybe when I was younger, when I felt energetic, healthy, and happy. And I'm like, man, I want to feel that way again. Well, I think most of us would feel very silly if we just ran around looking for that feeling. We understand that what we need to pursue is good physical health, and then that good feeling kind of flows out of the fact that we've gotten healthy again. But when it comes down to happiness, I do think we make precisely that mistake. Happiness is the result of something. Maybe it's good spiritual health, right? Maybe it's that relationship with God. And the happiness just kind of flows from that. But we often take happiness as if it's something separate, and we go pursuing it. And because it can't be divorced from what will make us happy, it becomes like the chimera of Greek mythology. We're out hunting after this elusive thing, and I think actually becoming more frustrated.
And part of that goes back to Boethius. One of the points that Lady Philosophy makes in the play is that if we're pursuing goodness for a selfish reason, we're not actually being good. We're being selfish, which is not good.
Prideful, arrogant, right?
Yeah, and so I think that's exactly it. We of course we want to be happy, and we need to take care of ourselves. If we love others as we love ourselves, there's some level of love directed at ourselves as well. Meaning we got to take care of ourselves, rest in God's love. But happiness for its own sake would be a sort of selfish, inward-facing perspective versus going out into the world.
And I think it's fundamentally an illusion to hunt for happiness for its own sake because it's connected with something. It's almost as if we need to kind of forget about it and pursue being in the right place that we're supposed to be in our lives. And then the happiness begins to be
happens.
Like, oh, hey, I'm happy now because... And so the quote I had that just kept coming to my mind was C.S. Lewis from Surprised by Joy. He spends the early part of the book detailing how he would have these poignant, stabbing emotions, bittersweet, he calls them, which he refers to as joy. And he loved them so much he wanted to get more of them. So basically his life was a pursuit of this feeling. And then eventually he details his conversion to Christianity. And by the time he comes to the end of the book, he kind of admits, we've stopped talking about joy. And his point is to say that it's not his focus anymore, but he still experiences it, perhaps more frequently than before. And he refers to joy as being a signpost, not an end in itself. And he says this, when we are lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. He who first sees it cries, look! The whole party gathers round and stares. But when we have found the road and are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us, and we shall be grateful to the authority that has set them up. But we shall not stop and stare, or not much, not on this road, though their pillars are of silver and their lettering of gold. We would be at Jerusalem. So he's saying, we have a destination. We need to be home, and that's when we will feel joy and happiness. But we need to be careful not to go pursuing the signposts. Right?
Yes.
The second thing that occurred to me is there is something written deep in the hearts of every one of us that is a need and a longing for the eternal and the infinite. Apparently, as humans, we cannot be satisfied with anything less. Other things can be. You know, my cat can certainly be satisfied with catching a mouse. They're not thinking about all of eternity.
Right.
But we have this immaterial soul, this intellect, which is, it can't help but think about it. Even when we kind of sort of shut down that process, it gnaws at us inside. And there are many delights, let's call them pleasures, which can be totally good in and of themselves. But I think we often also make the mistake of pursuing them, but they are finite. I think of pleasure as related to our senses, to our bodies. Well, our bodies, being matter, are finite, limited. The ways in which we can receive pleasure, maybe having a delicious meal or something, those are limited. And the amount of pleasure that can be given is limited. So when those become our pursuit, there's a moment, and then we got to replace it with another moment, and another moment, and another moment, and we're never actually satisfied.
Because eventually
And
you
it
have to eat again.
actually almost leads to more dissatisfaction. Yeah. So I would say the second problem is pursuing things that are limited, transient, or finite that can never truly fully satisfy us.
Another quote from C.S. Lewis that Father John Erdman always quotes is that, you know, it's an ever-increasing desire for an ever-diminishing reward.
That's what he calls sin.
Exactly.
Yeah, that wasn't one of
okay, good. I was like, I'm going to steal Isaac's quote.
And worse.
But I want
I'll get to it in a minute.
Maybe say the quote, and then I'll tell a little story about a comedian named Jim Jeffries.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is from Isaiah. It popped in my head today as perfect, because I think we do spend a lot of our lives working desperately for things that just really can't fulfill us, because we're made for more. And this is the prophet Isaiah. He says, all you who are thirsty, come to the water. You who have no money, come, buy grain and eat. Come, buy grain without money, wine and milk without cost. Why spend your money for what is not bread, your wages for what does not satisfy? Only listen to me, and you shall eat well. You shall delight in rich fare. Pay attention and come to me. Listen that you may have life. So I know in my own life, I've been guilty of spending a lot of my wages, and by that I mean the time and qualities, possessions of my own soul, in chasing that which does not satisfy.
Well, one of the big problems is we try to extract infinity from finite things. We have this infinite longing for this eternal satisfaction of the human heart. And I loved what you said, Isaac, about we're made to be at home. And this is not our home. It's a good shack, a tent, a place.
A bivouac, if you will.
A tabernacle.
Yeah, a tabernacle. Now, I'm not referring to
Did you say wiki up?
I said bivouac.
A bivouac. Okay,
bivouac, right. And I'm not referring just to to earth, right? Because there will be a new heaven and a new earth. I'm not just referring to my body, because my body is not just a prison for my soul, but it is corruptible in the sense where it will die, it will decay, it will become dust again. Yeah. And yet, through the faith in the resurrection, we'll get our bodies back. Earth will be redeemed. All things will be untwisted and resurrected in such a way where we'll be able to have that infinite satisfaction at home at last, because we're not on earth in utopia. We're with Jesus Christ, the personhood who embodies truth, goodness,
Who,
beauty,
as God, is
happiness
infinite.
itself.
Is
Right.
infinite. Yeah.
Right.
Brian, what were you
So
going to say?
there's an Australian comedian named Jim Jeffries,
Okay.
atheist, cynical, crude guy. No offense if he watches this.
Hey, Jim, come on our show.
Yeah.
Right.
But he has a bit about, okay, I'm not happy. I'm a stand-up comedian. It must be when I, get paid to do stand-up. That's when I'll be happy. And
Right.
then he says, and then I got paid to do stand-up and I still wasn't happy. And I thought, oh, well, it must be, when I'm the headliner, that's when I'll be happy. And then he says I was the headliner. And then it was, full-time comedian. And then I was a full-time comedian. And then it was when I'm doing, shows in front of 10,000 people, that's when I'll be happy. And then I was doing shows in front of 10,000 people and I still wasn't happy. And you can also tell in this that he's still not happy.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's an example of like he's aware. He's aware that this isn't satisfying and he's still trapped in the loop.
Right.
And that, to that C.S. Lewis quote of ever increasing desire for the ever diminishing reward.
Right.
Like even when we've got some self-awareness, and this happens to all of us, we've got concupiscence, we've got this,
Right.
Different addictions on different levels and things. And, even when you have self-knowledge, it's not enough. There's still something that traps us and gets us locked in and where we can't break free. And there has to be a moment where we just stop that chain.
This isn't working. Yeah.
And just make a definitive choice, but it requires the will. I mean, think of the attraction of things like pornography or video games or gambling, or sports. All of these things pull us in through the senses. So our eyes, whatever is shiny and bright and fun, whatever feels good bodily, right, with our adrenaline, whatever it may be, we can get trapped in an addictive cycle. Not because any of those things, well, some things are always bad, right, but because they're ultimately twisted distortions of the good. So pornography is never good, but the human body and sexuality and the love between spouses is good, right? So things like that are utterly twisted, but when you can experience them rightly, then suddenly you aren't idolizing them. You're not trying to extract infinity from those things because you see them as the signposts,
Exactly.
the icons pointing you to God, and you can enjoy them rightly in a way that over time, by living, a life of temperance and enjoying things without indulging in them and knowing when to say no, but also knowing when to feast, right? Catholics, we love feasting and fasting. We know how to do both. But when you're doing that, you find happiness as a byproduct, as it's just a state of being. Heaven is a state of being.
I want to take one of the things you said and add a little context, because you mentioned the will. There is the will involved.
Yes.
But if you think of something like Alcoholics Anonymous, there's also surrender. And recognizing that we can't do it by ourselves. So even atheists that go to AA, like one of the steps is acknowledging there's a higher power. And I'm not it, and I have to surrender and let go and say that I can't do this on my own. And that is a movement of the intellect and will. Yeah. But it's also a releasing of the will to God. And
it's a leap of faith, the theological virtue, the gift from God.
And a realigning,
And again, realizing that we ourselves are not going to be the source of our own happiness. The philosopher Sartre says hell is other people. It occurred to me the other day when I was going through some stuff. I was like, no, I think hell is myself. Yeah, and what I mean by that is kind of like that idea of a black hole. If my focus is strictly on myself, that's where hell comes in.
Yeah, they talk about hell as being locked, the gates locked from the inside.
Yeah.
When we get so turned inward, anything, when I fall so in love with some inward, whatever it is, pain, or when all my will is directed there, anything that calls us out of ourselves becomes something opposed to me. So any light, any truth, any goodness that's saying, hey, stop doing that. Well, F you. I want to do this now. And I've justified it in my head so many times that get away from me. And eventually, you get to the end of your life and you've turned so deeply inward that you confront truth itself, goodness itself. And in fact, it confronts you. And you say, get away from me. I never want to see you again. And God says, your will be done.
Oh,
C.S.
that's
Lewis again,
terrifying.
The Great Divorce.
Yes.
It's fictionalized, but he makes it clear that hell is the choice of the individuals. They actually look at heaven and are like, we don't like this, we don't want to be here, right? Because it demands something of them.
And they're not used to it.
Yeah.
They can't handle the light because they're so used to the darkness.
Number 3.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me get to this, because 3 and 4 I'm going to put together, but I think this is really getting into the heart of it. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this. So first was pursuing the feeling, right, on its own. And the second is pursuing things that cannot satisfy. So I think those are 2 things we do that make us very unhappy. But I think third and fourth kind of go together, and I think they're really critical issues in our society right now, is not understanding who we are as humans and what we are made for. Example that came to my mind is if I have a job to do and I take a tool that is totally unsuited for it, I don't have any idea what this tool is meant for, and I try to do this job with the tool, I'm going to wind up frustrated and probably damaging the tool in some way. Well, the same thing is true of us. If we do not understand the incredible value, worth, and dignity of the human person and what we are made for, we end up misusing and abusing ourselves. And tragically, those around us often misuse and abuse us, and we often do the same to them as well. And the example, you mentioned pornography a moment ago. When I think of this is precisely what comes to my mind. Matt Fradd makes a comment on a number of his shows. I don't know if it's an original or if he's quoting somebody else, but I love it. He says, the great problem of pornography is not that it reveals too much about a person, it's that it reveals too little. Yeah. And the point that he goes on to make is saying, you are allowed to see this person as being only a body and nothing more. That's the problem. It's dehumanizing. And the results of that are tragic. I would describe it as almost like spiritual murder. It's like saying, there you are, but the most important aspect of yourself, I'm going to cut out and I'm going to say, no, that doesn't count. I'm going to deny that. You are just an object. And furthermore, you're an object purely for my pleasure. And when I'm tired of you, I'm going to throw you away.
Yes.
Well, there is no possible way that does not lead to misery, right? And then I thought also about what are we meant for? Not just what are we, but what are we designed for? We are, not only do we yearn for the eternal and infinite, we've all been talking about this, but we're actually meant for it. We are actually designed in such a way that we are meant to actually experience eternal bliss. We are meant to actually understand, know, appreciate, and live everlasting life, joy, and love. That is something that, it doesn't mean we can meditate on that. That is so profound. And so I imagine that if you come and tell me, no, your only purpose is to do your job well. Your only purpose is to satisfy me. Your only purpose is to get high, whatever it might be. This is like, again, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's taking this infinite value, dignity, and purpose, and then trying to force it into this little container and say, no, this is all you are, and this is all you're good for. That is going to hurt. That is going to do damage. And the quote that I had, because I was also going to quote the St. Augustine that you had earlier, but this is another one from St. Augustine. I'd love to just kind of finish this up here and then let you guys say what you want. This cry of St. Augustine's that we are made for God and we will never be happy until we encounter the eternal. His other quote, I know this is a famous one. It's probably his other most famous quote, but the sheer beauty of it is worth saying again 100 times. Mm-hmm. Late have I loved you. I hope I can get through this actually. Late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. And behold, you were within, and I was in the external world, and sought you there. And in my unlovely state, I plunged into those lovely created things which you made. You were with me, but I was not with you. The lovely things kept me far from you, though if they did not have their existence in you, they had no existence at all. But you called and cried out loud and shattered my deafness. You were radiant and resplendent. You put to flight my blindness. You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath, and now I pant after you. I tasted you, and I feel but hunger and thirst for you. You touch me, and I'm set on fire to attain the peace which is yours. And I think that's what we're made for.
Amen.
I love that, Isaac.
Yeah. Good stuff by Augustine. No wonder he's a saint.
It's because he was able to see all as a gift from God. All
But he lived the
things.
life too.
He did.
He had tried every finite pleasure. He had tried other people, other things. And he finally realized the reason he was unhappy was because he was made for nothing less than infinity, nothing less than eternal joy.
For those that don't know his story, I mean, he ended up a bishop and a doctor of the church, which is a saint among saints, and wrote all these amazing, beautiful things about God. But he didn't start there. He wasn't baptized. He explored all these philosophies. He was a brilliant rhetorician, and he talks about growing up. You know, people recognized how great at rhetoric he was, and they would cheer for him. He got addicted to the cheers, and
Like your comedian.
and it got to the point where he got so addicted to praise as a child that he goes off to kind of university and he falls in with the wrong crowd, and he starts doing bad things simply to get praise from whoever will give it to him. So he steals a pear from the pear tree, and he says, "I didn't steal the pear because I wanted the pear. I stole it because my friends would praise me if I did."
Gosh.
And so he falls. He has a child, illegitimate child, a mistress that he can't let go of, and he's feeling this call to purity and chastity and holiness, and I think that quote. God make me holy, but not yet.
I think it's chaste, isn't it,
God make me chaste, but not yet.
Not yet,
is him.
Gosh.
And then finally he's in his garden with his friend, and he hears a kid playing a game outside the walls that tolle lege, take and read, and he opens up St. Paul and do you remember I don't remember the verse that he reads,
do not
but
remember.
It's something basically like, go for it. Like you need to make a decision here. And that is when he does. He realizes that, and he says, like, all the chains fall away, and he just makes the choice to follow Christ. And
that's God shattering his deafness.
And it's that higher power. It's the letting go. It's the surrender. God has, we've talked about the invasion of grace on this show before. Like, God makes the first move always, that we respond to God's grace. And so, like, God has just hit him again and again and again with love. And
a lot of it thanks to his mother Monica, who never stopped praying for him.
Yeah. It's 1 John, he said that it's not that we first loved, but that he first loved us. And it's that love that we receive from God at the right moment that then transforms us and starts to spill over naturally into the lives of other people.
Yeah.
One of the things, Isaac, while you were talking that came to mind was there's a guy named Leo Severino out in LA who does a lot of young adult ministry, produces movies and things like that. And but one of the things that he did a talk for us, and he talked about, like, he had gotten really into philosophy and thinking about God and all this stuff, and he had come up with the meaning of life, and it was seek God and all that stuff. And he's like, "I'm so smart, I came up with the meaning of life." And then his brother's like, "Oh, that sounds a lot like paragraph 1 of the Catechism." So he read this: "God, infinitely perfect and blessed in himself, in a plan of sheer goodness, freely created man to make him share in his own blessed life. For this reason, at every time and in every place, God draws close to man. He calls man to seek him, to know him, to love him with all his strength. He calls together all men, scattered and divided by sin, into the unity of his family, the church. To accomplish this, When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son as Redeemer and Savior. In his Son and through him, he invites men to become, in the Holy Spirit, his adopted children, and thus heirs of his blessed life. And so when you said, that we're made for eternity, and that we're, one of the things that came to mind is we are eternal beings. Life does not end.
Guys, we're going to know each other forever. This is great.
Boy, how you gonna do that?
Or at least know of each other. Assuming we all make it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, please.
But no, I mean, eternity's already started. I would say this to the kids in youth ministry. Eternal life has already started. The only choice is where you spend eternity. It's not whether you spend eternity. And so it's, eternity's here. It started. Welcome to eternity. But all you get to choose is it eternal life in heaven or eternal life in hell, like at the bottom line. And to go back to the culture, modern man or modern society says, do whatever you like, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Well, do whatever you like, it doesn't matter also means your life doesn't matter. And the Christian life, the story of God, is that it does matter, is that you matter, you have dignity, you have eternity, and there's like your eternal soul hangs in the balance. And so I just think that all of this is an antidote to this meaninglessness. If what we do doesn't matter, if we can just pursue whatever pleasure and there's no consequences, well, what that means is on some level we don't matter at all.
Well, it's a deep understanding that if you don't believe that you matter, then you literally become meaningless. But if you recognize in the midst of all the sensual pleasures and excitement that life has to offer, that it's not just random, but there's meaning behind it, suddenly you start making connections with past experiences. Your story starts to emerge. There's a plot, a narrative that you want to actually be a part of. So suddenly you realize that you have value, you have meaning, and you have something to contribute, not to the cog and the wheel of the machine of society, but to the grand story of love.
Yeah. I would say too on that point, and kind of wrap this up, everything we've been talking about here in this section, and then you reading that from the Catechism, keeps coming back to the fact that there is so much more worth to each individual human than we often recognize, and we are meant for so much more than we often recognize. I would say actually that a large part of our unhappiness, this is a bit paradoxical, but is due not to us wanting too much happiness, but because we really don't want enough.
Yes.
Because we are thinking what satisfies it are these tiny little limited things. We're not actually thinking big enough. And we've just heard in the Catechism how God, who is infinite bliss, life, goodness, out of a plan of sheer generosity, for no reason whatsoever except pure love, makes us to know and share that life. And so I would say to anyone listening, we've mentioned pornography. I also, not that long ago this year, had a friend who was a brilliant guy, had some issues, but loved the guy. And he was found a block from my restaurant in an alleyway after having been clean for a while from a fentanyl overdose. And I work in the restaurant industry. This is sadly common. This is not the first time. I would say when we look at these things, first of all, no judgment. Okay?
Right.
No judgment. These are traps which we fall into, and I think I can speak for all three of us here, that we have all spent periods of our lives personally pursuing things that were not God, and maybe even being addicted to them. But secondly, one of the reasons for that may be that we are actually satisfied with too little. We don't realize the greatness God has planned for us. So I would say to anybody that is watching or listening, if you are struggling with sadness, with despair, you have been abused, you've been treated as nothing, you have an addiction, whatever it may be, let this thought be in your mind the next time that you want to look at the pornography, the next time you want to get high is, this isn't good enough for me. there is so much more, and I am worth more than this. If you've been mistreated, if you've been abused in some way, realize that that is a lie which actually comes from hell. And God says, you are worth everything to me. Okay? So let's take a short break there and then ask the final question, how do we attain happiness? We come back with more on Spirit Spire.
Hey everyone, another sponsor for today's episode is the Cathedral of the Assumption in the heart of downtown Louisville, Kentucky. It is the spiritual center of parish and family life and is a historic treasure for the Catholic Church in America. Take a tour or consider visiting for Mass. Check them out at cathedraloftheassumption.org.
All right, welcome back to Spirit Spire. We've been talking about happiness today, and so far we've talked a little bit about what happiness is and a little bit about some of the ways in which we pursue things or misunderstand ourselves that make us unhappy. And so now I suppose the most important bit of all of this is, how do we attain happiness? And John, in the year I've known you, you're a pretty happy guy. So share with us your thoughts on how do we attain happiness?
Oh,
No
my
pressure.
goodness, no pressure.
This will be the easiest question of all, right?
Well, I would say I've not always been happy.
Yes.
But I have always exuded a enthusiasm and charm and passion that, sometimes feels like a mask in life, right? And I'll admit that, I've felt like a hypocrite before. I've felt empty inside, dead inside, whatever it is. It reminds me of like Robin Williams, the comedian, he took his life and it was so tragic, right? And I was like, how? Who? Of all people, right? But that's a common reality. And so for me, what I have learned over these years through all the different difficult things that I've gone through that I, at the right time, will get into in more detail, because, we did our introductory episodes and I'll want to, continue my story just like we all want to. But it comes down to a prayer life and an openness to God and the gifts He wishes to give us. At the end of the day, this is about love, and whether or not you feel lovable and whether or not love is worth experiencing in this life or even possible for you. I mean, there were times in my life where I felt I had ruined my life, where I wanted to kill myself. Not that I ever planned to do so, but I know people who have, right? And that's a very real thing today. But this feeling like love is this unattainable reality that for whatever reason we have been unfortunately given a desire for, right? We have this desire for eternal happiness, but there's no way to experience that. What kind of cruel, sick joke is that, right? And yet, as I have been stretched and purged of so many friends and ideologies and behaviors, I have started to get a taste of this concept of happiness that you shared in your quote, Brian, of this just living your life and trusting that when you're not just busy, I've heard busy as an acronym called buried under Satan's yoke. You're so busy and distracted by the world's entertainment and pleasures that you never answer life's deepest questions and never let God in.
I heard Curtis Martin say the other day, you can't kill time without injuring eternity.
Oh,
That's good.
Like, that is it.
That's the absolute truth. It's absolute truth. And so, there were times in my life I didn't know what my life was all about, what the whole purpose of. So I wanted and felt that there was purpose, didn't know what it was, didn't understand why I was suffering, why things didn't make sense. And yet I was making connections. I just couldn't communicate that deep longing that God was putting in my heart, I remember at 20, 21, 22 years old, I had this deep awareness that I existed. And I couldn't explain why. And all of a sudden it just overwhelmed me. And I tried to tell it to people, and people thought I was crazy, And I was like, okay, well, Jesus is real, and we're supposed to pray to Him. And He's not fictional like Santa Claus. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble. Then I've got to make it real. I have to have a relationship with Him. So what does that look like? I mean, I can't see Him. I can't talk to Him. In at least maybe I can. But what does that feel like? So I actually started carrying a picture of Jesus and the Divine Mercy around with me, frame and all, and literally carried it around with me like the entire year, 2012, 2013. And any of my friends who are listening to this are probably just laughing to themselves because they remember it, because I would literally buckle
Wait,
in.
you have friends that lasted all the way through this?
Shut up.
Wait a minute, you have friends?
That's terrible. No. Yes, they're all on Facebook, right?
Right.
But I
over 1,000.
literally buckled up the picture and carried it around. And what I was doing is internalizing this relationship that we're supposed to have with Jesus. And if he is the answer to our happiness, right, that I'm looking for. But you want to answer this question. Okay, what is happiness? What does it mean to be human? How can we live our lives that fill us with satisfaction and peace? You want to answer these questions, well, you answer it with Jesus is the answer. And yet a lot of people might say, well, what does a man who lived 2,000 years ago have to do with me? Mm-hmm. And it's this, okay, well, he resurrected from the dead. He's still alive today. That's all well and good. But do they feel loved by him? Do they actually trust that he is there and is really there? And that, to me, this is why I connected so deeply with theology of the body. Because in the Mass, Christ says, this is my body given for you. So the language of living a good life, of living a life of virtue, didn't hit me as much as being loved and being lovable and having a relationship with someone who actually cared about me. Not that I wasn't loved and cared for in my life and my family, but that there was a lot of pain and things I learned about as I got older that made me doubt it, made me wonder if, was it all just a facade? You know, a lot of secrets you learn in family life and friends that you feel betrayed by, whatever it might be.
Well, and sin does that too.
Yes, and it's all sin.
So,
right.
Because, you know, the one of the devil's tactics is he tells you before the sin is this is not a big deal. Yeah. And then after the sin, this is the biggest deal in the world. No one could ever love you. Yeah. God will never forgive you. And so that, you know, we can imbibe those lies that we hear, and it's, you know, obviously there's an external element of an unlovableness, but there's also this internal voice that we can hear. It can be our own at times, but it can also be the devil saying, you know, you're not lovable. No one could ever. You can never come back from this. Your past defines you. Things like that, and so we, you know. I really like what you're saying, John, because I think I'm thinking of, you know, again, to go back to love others as you love yourself. Yes. I'm thinking that, you know, I want others, and, you know, thinking of my family especially and my kids, you know, I want them to know that they are lovable, that they have dignity, that they that there's a beauty and an infinity that I want them to know about, and I want them to treasure. And I'm thinking and reflecting that, you know, well, of course, if I want that for others, I should try to live that and know that myself, because that's the hardest person to convince of that, if you will, or something.
I think one of my hardest things was, you know, as I was going through growing up at St. Luke and the fire and the rebuilding and all the things that happened in our community, I saw a lot of my friends that I was growing up with go through some similar things. But while I started asking questions about my faith and getting good answers, a lot of my friends didn't, and they just kind of fell away. They left the faith. They just didn't seem to connect to it. And I certainly couldn't explain it to them because I had made mistakes with some friends, other friends, and I didn't know how to say, you can't stop coming to church. You got to keep coming, right? I couldn't figure out how to say, stop believing these lies and start living this way. And this is where I think I put a lot of pressure on my girlfriend back in the day, right? Because I wanted her to have a life of faith and to really open her heart to Jesus. As well as many of my other friends. I would try to get them all to go to these conferences and pilgrimages and Jesus highs, right? That was my life. And so I was seeking this spiritual high, this spiritual mountaintop, without having a clue as how to put it into practice when I got off the mountaintop. So I would fall off the cliff right onto my face every time through my sins and my own feelings of hypocrisy and my own, finding out things about my family and friends and stuff that was just really shocking. And so it would almost try to rob me of my joy. And I was like, no, it has to be real. It's the only thing in the world that seems to actually be real beyond just a physical drug high or alcoholic binge, whatever it is, pornography, any of that stuff is never going to give me the satisfaction that the love and peace and joy that is so authentic that I was experiencing at these conferences was giving me. I just couldn't figure out how to sustain it in a healthy way without being obnoxious, right?
Do you think that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about pursuing happiness for its own sake? Instead of pursuing the things that will eventually give us happiness. When you look at the lives of the saints, and you start off talking about virtue, Brian, and growth in virtue. The saints are people that were growing in virtue to levels that we can't imagine, and growing in holiness and becoming more and more united to God. And all of them will say, there's these periods of dryness, of darkness, of no sensible awareness of God's presence, and that doesn't mean that they're doing badly. They're doing the right things.
Right.
I think that there is a danger here. I've experienced the same things, John. I think there's a danger for all of us to not only go and pursue the pleasures of the world, but to also pursue spiritual pleasures as if they're an end in themselves. Like, I'm going to Mass, I receive communion, I want to get that feeling. I want to get that, I want to feel Jesus' presence in some way, right? Or I go to a conference or pilgrimage or whatever. And we are chasing that high, to use your expression, much like we could chase a drug high.
Yes.
And God is asking of us faith. Whether we have the feeling or not, He's asking of us love, because we're doing it for His sake, because He is all good, not because of what feeling I'm hoping to get out of it. But man, the temptation is so easy. It's so
because
there.
What world do we live in? It's
Right.
bombarding us with feelings.
I
and
think
senses.
that God kind of lets us fall on our face and lets us get broken in those moments, so we begin to realize that's not the answer.
This is St. John of the Cross.
Exactly. This is Dark Night of the Soul.
Yeah. Again, for our audience, God. So if you are in despair and you need some hope or some light, it's my opinion that it's okay to ask God to reveal Himself to you.
Yeah.
Knock, and the door will be open. Seek, and you will find. This is not putting God to the test. It's not saying, do this or else. Yeah. But
I'll only follow you if you do this for me.
Right, right. There's an old painting of Jesus at the door to knock, and there's no handle on the outside of the door.
Right.
The handle, he's at a door that can only be opened from the inside. So if that's where you are, then you may need some consolation, some condescension. So it's God coming down to where we are and breathing life into us, lifting us out of the muck. It's that invasion of grace again.
Which, by the way, not to interrupt you, but it occurred to me earlier, that is a true extraterrestrial invasion. I've been needing to say that. Sorry, go on.
God.
Yes, E.T. is here.
E.T. phone home. Okay, keep going.
Well, and so when we talk about consolation, desolation, when we're talking about a dark night of the soul or eschewing, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, spiritual experiences, this is for someone that is a little further along the path. So where you were was, I know God is real on some level. I have faith that God is real, and now I'm seeking after these consolations, and that becomes an issue because you're seeing the consolation, not God Himself. And so God begins to take away some of those consolations so that we can experience life without it. And it's that dark night of the soul that purifies us, and that when sometimes we do fall on our face, humbles us and things like that, we realize we can only do it with God. Mother Teresa had desolation for some 40 years.
Yeah.
And
you never know what to look at her, though. She always radiated joy.
Yes.
Exactly. And so I just wanted to make that distinction that these are different parts of the spiritual life, and but to make the point that St. John of the Cross did say, you don't want to seek consolation for its own sake. Even supernatural experience, supernatural experiences, you need to be careful, not to dwell on the experience,
right.
but to leave it behind and continue to pursue God.
Well, because what you end up doing is trying to recreate that experience, and you end up worshiping the experience itself, and that can lead to intense desolation and despair where you reject it all completely.
And you run the risk of deception. I think that's
disillusionment.
Consolation is one thing, but the experiences, like mystical experiences, I think the saints have actually kind of said, you actually should not seek those.
Right.
Because when you do, if God gives you the gift, in fact, I forget who it was. I want to say it was St. Teresa that actually said they were very troubling and difficult for her, right? There is this thing like, well, okay, one thing if God gives you a vision or an ecstasy or something, if that were to happen. But when you seek that, you run the risk of a lot of illusion, a lot of deception, and it also kind of means to some extent that you're not living just out of love for God, right? You're still pleasure seeking. John, I didn't want to derail your train of thought, but you and Brian both were saying things about feeling lovable or not. And I don't know, I just felt like I really wanted to speak to that and to share this, because oftentimes when we feel unlovable is when we genuinely aren't doing well, when we literally have behaved in ways that are dreadful.
Oh yeah,
right?
It's fueled by shame.
Right, and so that makes that lie more believable to us. And I think that mercy, I used to think of mercy as something that we were given, like, okay, I don't deserve it, but thank God he's been merciful to me. Yay, I'm okay now. I now believe that mercy is an active force that transforms us. There's something about encountering unwarranted love and unowed mercy that changes you.
Mercy is like, I think it's Latin, misericordia is.
Misericordia
is a heart. Misery is misery. So it literally
like
means
anguish.
A heart that gives itself to those in misery.
The just agony of the heart.
Yes.
The last, I think, 2 episodes here on Spirit Spire, I haven't been here for them. And you guys know this, that I had a couple of very difficult weeks of some spiritual internal struggles, which in turn, it's ironic we're talking about happiness today, led to a lot of unhappiness in my life. And in which, quite frankly, I found myself fighting God's will for me. And in so doing that, I also then felt a lot of guilt. Right? And one of the thoughts that came to my mind during that time, which I think I've shared with one or both of you, but I'll share it here as well, is I thought of Peter and Judas. Both of them denied Jesus, right? Peter, maybe it's too much to say he betrayed him, but he did promise that he was going to stand up for him and he'd never forsake him.
Right.
And it occurs to me, even in the garden, when Jesus says, stay here and watch, I wonder if that, on an earthly level, wasn't watch for the soldiers who are coming and Peter falls asleep instead, right? There's definitely betrayal. There's definitely denial here, right? One of them becomes the rock upon which the church is founded, and the other one quite definitely doesn't. Both of them, it says, went out. Okay, this word is used twice. In fact, if you look at the New Testament, Peter and Judas are compared and contrasted constantly. It's something that's easy to miss. There's a distinct connection between these two men. But what happens here? What's the difference? Jesus turns and looks at Peter and he weeps. He breaks down and weeps. Guilt, shame, God, I'm unlovable. God, I'm worthless. I betrayed you. I denied you. Judas very honestly goes and says, I betrayed innocent blood. Judas doesn't deny his sin. He is also keenly aware, I have done really badly here. Judas goes and hangs himself because it's the end for Judas in his own mind. He hears the lie. It's despair time. I have done that which cannot be forgiven, thinks Judas. Peter in the past has told Jesus, stay away from me. I'm a sinful man. Remember this Bible verse. It's so understandable. God, I'm not worthy. Stay away from me. But after the resurrection, Jesus gives Peter 3 times to be redeemed. Do you love me, Peter? Do you love me? Do you love me? What is the difference between Peter and Judas? The fact that Peter was able to accept mercy.
Yes.
They both sinned. They both denied their Lord. They both betrayed him. They both recognized it. They both probably felt like crap. Neither one of them deserved mercy. The only difference was that Peter would say, okay, I'll accept it. And it transforms him and makes him a new man.
It reestablishes masculinity, his ability to lead. And I believe it flows, our happiness flows from our redemption. Our redemption of our bodies, our souls, our behavior, and it's reconciliation. So reestablishing right relationship with the God who made us and sustains us at every moment, where we feel, because of what we've done or what's happened to us, we are unlovable, irredeemable, worthless. And those things lead to the despair, the unhappiness, the anger, the self-hatred. But when we allow God to love us, when we receive that love, that is what changes our life. And I think for me, what changed my life the most, the invasion of grace we're talking about, Brian, was this slow invasion. It wasn't some big Jesus high where he just hit me over the head. I mean, that powerful moment that I experienced at World Youth Day in 2019 with you in Panama, that we'll share at some point, was one moment, but it was because of all these other slow things that God had been doing, specifically for me with theology of the body and the understanding I was getting with the love between a man and a woman and their call to give and receive, and that mutual submission out of love for one another is what allowed me to let my wife love me when I didn't feel lovable, when I didn't feel redeemable, when I felt I had ruined my life to the point where I could never get married. I could never truly be at peace with myself as a person for the trail of tears I had left in my wake because of the things I had done to other people. That was what was crippling me. And it was God entering into my life to show me the love, the communion, the redemption, the self-gift. In fact, that's, I think, the biggest word that changed my life. The gift of God's love that poured into me so thoroughly that I can't help but be a gift to others. And in so doing, I find my true self. This is John Paul II, who probably wrote this passage in the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, which is translated to what? What is Gaudium et Spes?
Gaudium has something to do with rejoicing, right?
Faith and joy.
Joy, okay.
Joy, which is part of happiness, this whole topic we've been discussing. He said, man cannot fully find himself except by making a sincere gift of himself. And by making a gift to ourselves, to our wife as men, but also to others who are receptive and open. And we are also receptive and open and willing to be taught. Like you've taught me so much, Brian. You teach me so much, Isaac. Like to be willing to be taught is to be willing to receive the gift. And in so doing, you learn to be a gift to others. And to me, that is the path by which we experience authentic, lasting happiness. Not because we've reached happiness as an end in itself, but we experience happiness through our relationship with a person, Jesus Christ, who is love. Our ultimate goal is not happiness, it's love.
And happiness is the byproduct of that.
Yes.
John, could I maybe from what you're saying, and this is so powerful to me, and as we come to close this segment, would this be a good way to sum this up as to the attaining of happiness? You speak of gift. We have spoken of how we are made for more, how we are made to know and love the eternal, infinite God. Would it be then, and we've also talked about how when we feel unlovable and can't accept God's mercy, we're really shutting that out. Could we sum this up then by saying that God, who is infinite, eternal love and life, has made a complete and total gift of himself to us?
Yes.
And if we are to attain happiness, our only response can be the gift of ourselves and love back to him.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. It's the receiving and
that
giving.
is the mathematics of happiness, I think.
Receiving plus giving equals happiness, love. Yes, that's exactly it.
Did you have something there, Brian?
Yes, I was not texting. I was looking up. But the Vatican website does not have a good mobile version, so I need to get out my glasses, which don't exist, and read this in between segments. But I did want to read something from Gaudium et Spes. Maybe to close this segment, I did grab a Bible verse, which I think is
always
speaking,
quoting scripture. Is so
speaking here, Psalms 16:11. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore.
Amen.
Amen.
Good stuff. Thank you, Brian. All right, well, we'll be back after this next message here on Spirit Spire with some final thoughts and conversation on this topic of happiness. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, here at Spirit Spire, we want to serve our community by highlighting God's work in our parishes, schools, and apostolates. We hope to bring renewal and unity between all those in the body of Christ. If you would like a shout out in the next episode of Spirit Inspire, go to spiritinspire.com or email us at spiritinspire@gmail.com. Thanks and God bless.
All right, well, welcome back for our fourth and final segment today. We've been talking about happiness, and so far we've talked about what is happiness, what are some of the things we do which make us unhappy, some of the reasons for our unhappiness, and how do we attain happiness. So our last section, I think we all have a few remaining thoughts we'd like to tie up with. I'll go first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Just really two quotes. Earlier, I had, as you know, had a few quotes I'd read, and when I was pulling some quotes, and one came to mind, which you had reminded us of a few weeks ago, John, and so I went to look for it on the internet and discovered it was one of those misattributed quotes. I thought it was Chesterton, and it's not. But this fits in so well with things we've been talking about. Apparently, there was a Scottish writer by the name of Bruce Marshall. I've never heard of this guy. He wrote a novel called The World, the Flesh, and Father Smith in 1945. And the scene from which this comes, I read up on this and I was fascinated by it. Apparently, he meets a woman of not the finest reputation, and she's like, I've always wanted to meet a priest. I have so many questions. I want to talk to you, all of this. And so they're walking along and chatting. And she asks him about being celibate and how he can deal with that. She's very interested in the sexual topic. And he points out how even that will eventually wear thin, the sexual pleasures, the body gets older and all this and that. And he says, how only God can satisfy. And she says rather triumphantly, as I thought, religion is just a substitute for sex. And his response is this, and we'll know the end of this quote quite well.
This is great.
But it's not Chesterton.
Sure.
And of course he turns it around. He says, I still prefer to believe that sex is a substitute for religion, and that the young man who rings the bell at the brothel is unconsciously looking for God.
Wow, that's not Chesterton.
It's not Chesterton.
Wow.
I know. But I think the whole context there was actually very meaningful to the fact that we are always pursuing these kind of lesser pleasures at the expense of not realizing, the high calling, the infinite God for which we're made. The personal thing I wanted to share, and then I'd like to hear your guys' closing thoughts. We've spent a lot of time today talking about being unlovable and recognizing that our value and our worth is greater than we think. And that is not because of anything we do. You read from the Catechism earlier, this was a sheer act of just outrageous, gratuitous mercy on God's part to make us at all, right? Like it's nothing that we deserved.
Yeah.
But there is also peace in that, because I think that we do, and look, we're Catholics. We believe in virtue. We believe in doing certain things. We believe in works as well as faith, right? So I'm not denying that. It's the fact, though, we do have to recognize in the end, ultimately, that what matters is that God has loved us for nothing we've done. It's his own free choice. And I shared with you all how I had a couple of weeks of great darkness myself. And in the midst of that, because I found myself fighting against God's will and feeling I was really just like rejecting him in my life, I felt this Judas Peter question. I felt this, can I still be forgiven? Don't I know too much You know, it's one thing to say, well, you were ignorant. But I'm like, God showed me too much. God's been too good to me. God has shown me so much love. You know, have I gone too far? Am I still forgivable? Right? These were the kind of really damnable thoughts I was thinking.
Yeah, gets in your head.
And a passage that came back to my mind more than once. And maybe this will just be of some value to anybody listening. There's a passage in one of the prophets, I do not remember what it is, but God says, I have loved you, O Israel, because I have loved you. I love the absolute lack of any reason for anything that Israel has done. I have loved you, O Israel, because I have loved you. And I think there was a similarity in sound between the words. And so almost immediately I stuck my own name in there. I have loved you, Isaac, because I have loved you. And this was the message for me, was the realization of, no, you're not beyond hope. And by the way, when you thought you were being good previously, that wasn't why I loved you then either. Mm-hmm. It is completely unmerited. And that brings peace. That is the mercy that transforms, is to realize, have that incredible awareness of, I have loved you because I'm God, because I am love and I can do no other. So that to me, that brings happiness.
Makes me think that maybe we should meditate on that very passage, putting our name in place of Israel in
I think it's a good practice,
church
actually.
and adoration,
and realizing that God
that.
is literally at all times saying that to us. Put your name in there and realize
so everyone
God,
at home,
God is
do
speaking
this.
that to you.
Take that passage and say, I have loved you, John, because I have loved you. And
Whether you think you're good,
Yes.
there's a bit of humility. When you think you're bad,
Oh, of course.
it's a bit of peace.
yeah.
Brian, what are your
got,
closing
Brian?
thoughts here?
I wanted to hear you talk
John,
about
what do you-
vocation
yes.
Oh,
first,
sure.
because I thought that was a good tie-in to
Absolutely.
what I was gonna say.
So for me, one thing I learned about theology of the body is that, part one is about what is man, origin, history, destiny. Part two is how can I live my life in a way that brings true happiness? Now that I know who I am, how can I live? And the first focus is on vocation. So you have celibacy for the kingdom, and so this is priest, religious, all of that, consecrated life. And then you get into the sacrament of marriage and the family life and all the messiness and passion and romance and sacrifice that's involved in there. And then, only then...
Family life's difficult?
Right. Difficulties. And only
really
through
can.
that lens is John Paul II ready to break open the gift of the Catholic sexual ethic, the way we should live. So this is, to me, where you get into virtue and all of that. I mean, it's almost like JP2 gives us this total vision of man that Paul VI called for in Humanae Vitae. Like, what is man? What does it mean to live, to exist, to be happy? How can we do all of these things? And so that way, when we look at virtue, when we look at the lifestyle we're made for, we don't look at it as an oppressive list of rules or obligation or things we have to do or just good actions and choices, but as a gift, an inheritance, a lifestyle of happiness that every person should desire. The reason we hate the speed limit is because we desire to break it. And so I'm not going to become a priest or religious or a married man because I desire all these illicit, forbidden fantasies and things that I've gotten used to, or whatever it is. I won't be faithful, or I won't follow through on my commitments to my children or to my family because I'd rather be out gambling or drinking or partying with friends. All of these excuses we make. And so Christ came not just to change our ethic, but he came to change our ethos and our eros. So eros is that upward impulse toward of the human spirit to the good, the true, and the beautiful, so that what is even erotic becomes true, good, and beautiful, so that even those distortions of the culture can be untwisted and we can see as God sees. But then our ethos is that disposition basically the things that attract us or repulse us. So it has to do with the deepest desires of our hearts. So Christ came not to just abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, to help us desire to live the law out. And the only way you can get people attracted to the truth of living the right way, a life of virtue, and desiring a vocation, because many people today sadly think when you say vocation, you're talking about vacation. They don't even know what the word means anymore. And so how do we help everyone see that vocation really has to do with your purpose? So you start with identity, who am I? Your purpose, how can I live? And your lifestyle. And what lifestyle gives you actual lasting happiness that isn't fleeting, and respects the reality of lived earthly circumstances as well as the ultimate fulfillment of all desire, which is God, right? So both and. And I think if you go in that order, you can help people want to discern their vocation and be open to God's will for them, as well as strive to live a life of virtue, because they'll love the word virtue. They'll love the word vocation because you first inspired them with words like love, communion, relationship, redemption, and gift, becoming a gift to others. I think that's my final main
It's the transformation of the heart. It's Jeremiah. I will take out their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. I will write my commandments on their hearts. It is St. Paul. Love is the fulfillment of the law. It's so easy to hear that and say, oh, he means I don't have to do the law anymore because I love people.
That's not it.
He's saying, if you have true, authentic love in your heart, you will actually follow the law then. Because you want to.
Yes.
You want to do what is right and true.
This is how God designed it. It works. It's perfect.
Yeah. You said a lot there, John. It's very interesting. You know, I think the word erotic would probably
it can be very, very
trip
scary.
people here, because you know, we have a wide audience. You know, you're really talking about that desire that we have, and the erotic desire is sort of the earthly desire, if you will, in some level. It can get misdirected really fast. It's probably the easiest level. It's that direction of passion is the easiest to get directed. But God even wants to redeem that. And you know, one thing that comes to mind there, maybe as context, is that before the fall, Adam and Eve, they had perfect control of their bodies. So they're rather than sometimes we get controlled by our flesh post-fall. So our flesh controls our intellect and will at times. Adam and Eve, their intellect and will perfectly controlled their bodies, and so they were able to, through an act of the will, kind of unleash their passions, if you will, at the proper things. Correct. And they knew the good, and they unleashed their passions toward them on some level. And so in Christ, we can get back to that. Right. And get back to the controlment of our passions. We're not Stoics, we're Catholics. Catholics think that passion and that emotion are part of the good and redeemed human experience, but they're tempered by virtues, especially temperance. Yes. And I'm thinking that it's just so interesting. We've been talking about happiness and how much sexuality has come up, and purity and chastity in this episode. And I can't help but think that probably sins against chastity and integrity, and chastity to me is your body acting in accordance with the good and with your will. So knowing the good and doing it. Yeah, exactly. Marriage
it's not abstinence.
We're called to be chaste in
marriage.
It
involves these things, but chastity is the integration of your desires into your sexuality, into the rest of your humanity, so that you can live it in a healthy way.
So a priest is chaste in a different way than a married man.
Yeah. Right.
But I can't help but think that probably some of the most grievous sins and grievous wounds and grievous points of despair and shame and guilt are in
that
the
sphere.
Purity, sexuality sphere, just with the state of the culture and that sort of thing. So I also just wanted to kind of say that if that's something you're struggling with, that God can heal that, and I think probably all of our stories have some element of healing there. And
it probably came up so much because we're three guys.
Well, but even still, I mean, even women now are and
we're all affected by this culture that has gotten people confused and frustrated and wounded because of abuse or neglect on a sexual level even, right?
And increased objectification. Back to what I was saying earlier, you know, I look at somebody who becomes viewed as an object, or worse yet, somebody who was abused sexually, like maybe as a child. That inevitably leads to emotional and mental great distress, very deep wounds. And I think when you look at it from that perspective, it's easy to understand why, because they have been told through actions that you are literally nothing.
Yes.
You've been made to be nothing.
And it's the flip side too. It's the person who has objectified. It's the person who has abused. It's the person, there's shame and guilt on that side too.
Absolutely.
But there's also mercy and redemption on that side.
And this is why when you are redeemed from wounds, especially of a sexual nature, when you have allowed Christ to love you in that ache, in that despair, I feel like that redemption is what gives you an overwhelming joy and a peace about your life. Because if you are able, through God's grace, to be delivered of the worst kinds of behaviors and feelings and thought patterns and addictions, the happiness is beyond comprehension. It is unfathomable joy. And that is, to me, how you become an authentic witness to the resurrection, a true disciple. I heard, I kind of created this, but it was an acronym I heard of. You have to identify it as an addict if you want to recover from any addiction, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I hate that because that's not your identity. But then everybody kept harping on that because I'm a child of God. I'm not just an addict on whatever. But I was like, well, okay, I'm an addict because I am a destined disciple in Christ, transformed. Or maybe transforming. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Right? And with that understanding, I can allow God to love me in the midst of that pain or sin or darkness. And with that, I find overwhelming happiness and peace.
So my quote I was going to read is from Gaudium et Spes. It's a Vatican II document.
It's what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Man cannot fully find himself, except this is more to it. Oh, it's so good.
And JP2 kind of called this the heart of his papacy. So God's love fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. And to me, in that truth, in God's love and deliverance and healing, like John just said, is the path to happiness and the path to salvation. And one of the things that I talk about in Boethius, one of the things he learns to bring it all the way around.
I love this guy's name.
That God is also perfect truth. So the closer we get to the truth, the more happy we are. And so not only is it virtue, but also the truth makes us happy. And so hopefully we've all learned something. We've encountered truth in a deeper way on this episode. And so I can tell you I'm a little bit happier because of this time we've spent together.
Me too. I think maybe our next episode could be, what is truth? Like Pontius Pilate said, but I don't know.
That's a good one.
It gets us into it. All right.
Well, I would say that I tend to be a little bit happier every time I hang out with you guys.
Me too, guys. Me too.
And hopefully, for those of you watching, that will have a similar effect on you.
And we love everybody, so.
Yeah.
But
I do feel in a very unplanned way today, we've kept hitting on this topic of the awareness of God's love and mercy, of the intrinsic value of each human person, and the incredible, incredible purpose for which we were created. So I think if there's one takeaway from that for everybody listening and watching today, let it be that wherever you are in life, remember how much you're worth. I have had two priests, it's my last closing bit, that have told me some very wise things over the years. They were very simple statements. This relates to something you said a moment ago, Brian. Priest told me when I would be crushed under guilt of sins, he said, why do you think the devil tempts you? It's not really about the sin that he wants you to commit. It's about the despair and hopelessness that follows it. That's where he wants you. Okay? And when I would be in those moments, another priest told me, look at the cross if you want to know how much value you have in God's eyes. Okay? So as we contemplate happiness, and we pray for everyone to experience in the end that true, ultimate, eternal happiness, let's keep that in mind, that however we may view ourselves, God views us as worth enough to become one of us, and to offer his very life for us, not only on the cross, but at Mass every single day, to be united to us, to give himself to us in an act of perfect love, so that we, by giving ourselves back to him, may learn to find eternal happiness. We'll be back next week with more on Spirit Spire. May God bless each and every one of you.